Welcome to episode 25 of the Tax Professionals podcast. In this episode, you will learn how to protect businesses against and get HMRC insight into the criminal offence of failure to prevent the facilitation of tax evasion, with this episode's guest, Samuel Dean, who is the HMRC lead for this offence.
Welcome to the Tax Professionals podcast, the podcast dedicated to helping you improve your tax career. Here's your host, Jack Bonehill.
About 2 years into my tax career, the Criminal Finances Act 2017 introduced the corporate criminal offence of failure to prevent the facilitation of tax evasion. I provide a lot of advice in the recruitment sector, which is listed as a high-risk sector for the offence by HMRC, and as a consequence, I have been helping clients to protect themselves against the risk for about 4 years now. It's still something that I find a lot of people are unaware of, and even if they are aware, many have misunderstandings or misconceptions about it. This is resulting in businesses leaving themselves open to risk. In this episode, Samuel Dean, HMRC's lead for the Corporate Criminal Offence, or CCO, gives you the information to understand the offence, how you can help businesses protect themselves against it, and provide you with behind-the-scenes HMRC insight into the CCO. Sam has been working for HMRC since 2009, with his work centring around tax fraud, tax evasion and offshore non-compliance, and he has been heavily involved in establishing HMRC's enforcement approach and the investigations in relation to CCO. Make sure you don't miss any future episodes of the podcast that will help you to progress, develop and improve your tax career by signing up for email notifications at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/subscribe. These will give you a brief summary of each episode so that you can decide if you want to listen. Episodes are bi-weekly and released on Mondays. Without further ado, let's get into the episode. Just to kick off the episode for today, could you just tell us a little bit about your tax career and particularly the work that you do now?
Yeah, of course, Jack. So most of my career in HMRC. So I've been in HMRC for just over 11 years now. And most of it has been in our sort of top-end civil investigation and more latterly criminal investigation team, now the Fraud Investigation Service, predominantly in and around offshore tax evasion. And then over the last few years, I've been HMRC's lead for what we call our sort of enablers of criminality program. So looking at those who help people commit tax evasion ultimately. And as you'd expect, a big part of that is corporate criminal offence, which chunk of what we're going to be talking about today. So main part of that role is implementation lead for CCO. As you'd expect, developing training, guidance material, reviewing potential CCO investigations, building the pipeline of potential CCO investigations, and advising some of our investigation teams in how they can structure their investigation. And probably a bit bigger change over the last 12 months, Jack, I'd say, is I've probably put more time into stuff like this. So engaging externally on CCO through LinkedIn, webinars and podcasts like this, just so that people know what they're doing and what to expect from CCO.
Yeah, because the first time that I kind of come across you on LinkedIn was from the videos that you've been putting out there, which I thought were really good from an educational perspective, because they're just small bite-sized videos and almost debunking the myths around CCO, which is what I thought it'd be great to get you on to talk about the corporate criminal offence a bit today. And I'm sure we're going to go into some of the other parts of your role later around CCO, because all of them sound pretty interesting to me, to be honest. But just so listeners can understand then, could you just, I suppose, explain to us a bit about what the corporate criminal offence of failure to prevent facilitation of tax evasion is? We know it's a bit of a mouthful, but exactly what is it?
Yeah, it is a bit of a mouthful. That's why I sort of keep calling it CCO, because I'll always get it wrong if I try and give it its full title. As you expect, and probably as you've clearly seen on the LinkedIn videos, I thought quite a bit about CCO. But in short, legislation that came in 30th September 2017 and is a new strict liability criminal offence, which is committed by a company that fails to prevent its employees or associated persons from facilitating tax evasion. And there's a fine potential fine and sanctions, unlimited fines, unlimited sanctions for a successful prosecution of the offence. There are three main stages to the offence. So firstly, there has to have been evasion of UK taxes, duties. That could be an individual, could be a company. Secondly, that tax evasion has to have been deliberately and dishonestly facilitated by someone. So let's call them, for sake of argument, let's call them the enabler or the facilitator. Now, those two parts of the legislation is nothing new. You know, we've always investigated and prosecuted tax evasion, and you know, we've investigated and prosecuted enablers in the past. The bit that's new is that if that enabler, that facilitator at that second stage is acting for or on behalf of a company when they facilitate that tax evasion, that company is now automatically guilty of failing to prevent them from facilitating tax evasion. And I guess if I can just go one step further, so not only is it a strict liability offence, but also the reverse burden of proof applies. So normally, you know, if HMRC is prosecuting somebody for tax evasion, the burden is on the prosecutor to prove the guilt of the defendant. Here, the burden is on the corporate, the company, to demonstrate that they did have reasonable preventative procedures in place, not for the prosecutor to prove that they didn't.
Yeah.
So there are 6 guiding principles of what reasonable preventative procedures look like. It's published in the government guidance, but it's probably not worth getting into too much detail on those now, Jack, because again, I'll be talking for a while, but hopefully that's a quick overview of what it is and why it's different.
Yeah, I think probably the most important point that you've said there really is that it's always been a crime to facilitate tax evasion, but the new part from the offence is the corporate failing to prevent that from happening. And I suppose that's what I would usually describe as almost self-policing legislation, which we're seeing a lot of that being introduced, you know, also with like the R35 legislation changes that are coming in from April this year. It's just kind of just a almost like a general shift of what we're seeing from HMRC. I think is that kind of, I suppose, what you're seeing as well.
So yeah, I mean, it was modelled on the Bribery Act, so it's not new in that sense in terms of corporate responsibility, but certainly the strict liability nature, reverse burden of proof, failure to prevent is probably new for HMRC.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You do make an interesting point now as well, Jack, that, as I said, you know, we have investigated and prosecuted enablers before, but where this legislation is different is, you know, if we were wanting to attribute or trying to attribute responsibility to a corporate for that facilitation, it's the sort of the directing mind and will test. So for all intents and purposes, we'd have to prove that director or someone with a significant position of control in the organisation knew about the facilitation. Whereas for CCO purposes, it doesn't matter if senior management in the organisation didn't know anything about it, the corporate still commits the offence. So we don't need guilty knowledge at a senior level for this legislation.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it really is putting like almost a responsibility on the corporate to just ensure that they've got good enough prevention procedures in place. But just, I think probably a few areas where people tend to have questions from my experience are about kind of, I suppose, the difference between tax avoidance and tax evasion in these circumstances. So if someone was to facilitate tax avoidance rather than evasion, would the offence still be committed, for example?
Yeah, no, CCO is only about tax evasion. So we're talking there about deliberate, dishonest conduct. So not deliberately not paying what you owe or falsely claiming repayments or reliefs that you know you're not entitled to. So it's not about tax avoidance. It's not about legal interpretation, carelessness, negligence. It's not about, you know, finer technical points of tax. It's ultimately legislation about dishonesty and criminal conduct. So always keen to make that point when talking about CCO. We're talking about criminal behaviour, and it's always quite a perverse thing sometimes when someone from HMRC is talking about HMRC legislation, so it's not really tax legislation, because it's not. It's legislation about the conduct of employees and associated persons. and what a responsible organisation needs to do to try and prevent that criminal conduct.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And then I think the second point where people tend to get confused or don't understand is about exactly what associated persons are. So you've already mentioned that any employees of an organisation would be an associated person, but who else would be an associated person? Because I think that's where there's a lot of confusion.
Yeah, and there's probably not going to be a terribly helpful answer from me on that, Jack, because it's so much dependent on the company, the organisation, the sector it operates in, how it operates, how it's structured. So the way in which the legislation and the guidance terms associated person, it's anyone deemed to be acting for or on behalf of the company. So as you said, obviously employees fall into that category, but so too could other service providers, contractors, payroll providers, anyone who could be deemed to be acting for or on your behalf could be an associated person. And I guess the bit of advice or steer that I would give, as part of an organisation doing their risk assessment, you'd very much expect companies to look at who could be deemed an associated person. And I guess if there's any element of doubt as to whether or not someone could be considered an associated person, then the advice would probably be to steer on the side of caution and treat them as if they were.
Yeah, and then try and get prevention procedures in place around them. So I think that kind of clarifies that not every single supplier of an organisation is going to be an associated person. It's going to depend on whether they're providing services for or on behalf of the organisation. And if they're not, then they're not going to be an associated person.
Yeah, and so there's no sort of necessarily like a HMRC clearinghouse for those arrangements and those contractual obligations. It will come out in terms of the investigation if they were to be deemed an associated person. But there is something, I think there's a line in the guidance. I should know the guidance off by heart, but I wouldn't confess that I know every line by line. But I'm pretty sure there's something in there about that you can't necessarily contract your way out of an associated person. So in the scenario, if you've got someone that you would deem to be an associated person, agreeing some sort of contract that says, you and you alone are responsible for the conduct of your organisation, your employees, and it's nothing to do with us, that doesn't get around the associated person test. So the importance of that risk assessment and understanding the people that you do business with, the people that may be acting for on your behalf, is a really, really important part of that risk assessment.
Yeah, makes sense. I mean, just then to give a bit of almost colour to this, then have you got any examples you could give us about where the offence has been committed? And if you've got any real life ones, I think those would be really interesting to hear about.
Yeah, I always try and steer clear of real life examples, particularly for ongoing investigations. But I know certainly some themes that I've talked about before, and you've mentioned, the CCO Club on LinkedIn. So there's some stuff on there. The bit that I always try and caveat examples with, and particularly, if your listeners are waiting for me to give an example that resonates with them, goes, oh right, yeah, okay, now I get it. That might not happen simply because the application of CCO is so broad. When we talk about enablers, we talk about any third party providing a service that results in a commission, that results in offence against HMRC function. So it's beyond what sometimes people jump to when we talk about tax evasion. People might jump to, complex offshore structures or hidden accounts trying to hide who owns and who's behind different companies and different transactions. And sometimes companies will think, oh, well, we don't have those type of customers, or we don't provide those kind of services. And as I said, a couple of videos on LinkedIn, and on one point which I always make is often around invoicing. So most companies will have someone responsible for maybe paying or issuing invoices, and as a function, there's a possibility there for that person to facilitate tax evasion, be that agreeing to manipulate the vatable goods or services with a valued customer to help them claim some additional VAT back, for example. is tax evasion, is the facilitation of tax evasion. And as I said, I could probably talk forever and a day about CCO and examples, but they'd never be exhaustive. So again, as part of that risk assessment, it's just looking at what potential there is for that dishonest conduct. And as I said, there's plenty of other things on LinkedIn that people can look at. But I wouldn't want people to hear sort of one or two examples and think, oh, well, that's what CCO is all about. It's far, far broader than that.
And since you mentioned that it came into play in September 2017, which is coming on to, I suppose, 3.5 years ago now, really, what's your experience in terms of how well businesses are preparing for this and implementing their own prevention procedures? Are they doing a good job of it? Are they doing enough? Or is there like a lot of misunderstanding at the moment?
I think it's probably, on the whole, I'd say reasonably well, but as you would expect, there are variances in terms of perhaps the size of firms or within different sectors. So I guess I'd say that the larger firms, the larger organisations with more well-established corporate governance functions, around anti-money laundering, around bribery, have probably got it quicker than most. Some companies in the more sort of non-traditional financial services sectors, for example, may take a little bit longer simply because of that realisation of application. And equally, as you get down the scale in terms of size of organisation, some of the smaller firms may not have grasped it as much as the larger firms, but I certainly think they're getting there. And the amount of stuff that I've been doing over the last 12 months, so podcasts like this, webinars and other external events, are all geared at trying to do as much as we possibly can to make sure people are aware of their obligations. The bit that I would say alongside that, though, is we've always been clear that preventative procedures should be both reasonable and proportionate. So, what we would expect a large multinational company with high-risk customers to do is going to be dramatically different to what, say, we'd expect a small firm with low-risk customers to do, for example. So that principle of proportionality is really important.
Yeah, and I imagine that's going to be entirely subjective and based on the particular facts of an organisation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Are there any kind of almost common myths that are out there around the corporate criminal offence at the moment, or any misunderstandings that it's just not applicable to them? Are there any key ones that kind of stand out to you?
Yeah, a couple of ones, Jack. So I've mentioned the one around, we don't provide tax advice or financial services, so we don't have exposure to CCO legislation is one I've seen and heard quite a bit. So that's one we've probably already put to bed. I think there's another one that I hear quite frequently around, I don't know if it's a myth or rather a misperception that companies, relevant bodies' own tax affairs are relevant. They're not. So a company could be perfectly tax compliant in its own right, never have had an issue with HMRC, never committed tax evasion in their own affairs, and yet still commit the offence. It's about someone within that organisation or acting for that organisation facilitating somebody else's tax evasion. So sometimes you hear that first line of, well, we're perfectly tax compliant. Yes, but what have you done in relation to this legislation about preventing people facilitating tax evasion? So that is one I hear quite a bit, and probably a good one to sort of point out and make sure people don't fall into that trap.
Yeah, I suppose that's a good one. I didn't even think about that one really, but that's the key point, isn't it? As you've said, it's nothing to do with the tax affairs of the organisation itself. It's to do with the tax affairs of who the associated persons are facilitating the tax evasion of, wouldn't it?
Yeah, exactly right.
I mean, that's a bit of a mind blow, isn't it, to get your head around that one. You can see easily though how businesses do have a misunderstanding around it, because there is a lot of words in just the name of the offence itself, and also in relation to when the offence is committed. So it's easy to confuse, I suppose, isn't it?
Yeah. It is. I suppose yes and no. I'd probably say yes and no. I know the title isn't the catchiest bit of legislation in the world, but there's quite there's quite a lot of information in the guidance, and is a really good read. But it's just, as you say, that reminder when we talk about tax evasion, facilitation of tax evasion, that they're slightly different things. So it's always a helpful thing to remind people of that.
Yeah, to be fair, although the title is long, if you do read it, it is pretty clear what it is in relation to, doesn't it? It does make it clear it's not about your own tax affairs. Really, it does make it clear that it's about others. And then just then, in terms of people who have kind of tried to implement prevention procedures, is there anything that you've kind of seen where there's like a common weakness almost, or something that they could improve on? That, I don't know, that a lot of businesses have done similarly.
Yeah, I think I see aspects of this. I've talked before about, firms that have got experience in AML, anti-money laundering, or bribery tend to get it quicker, which they do, but sometimes there's an over-reliance on existing bribery or AML procedures. So again, in our guidance, we say that may offer a good starting point for a company to think about what reasonable preventative procedures might look like. But it is just that, a starting point. That it's a different offence looking at a different thing. So some of the procedures put in place for bribery and money laundering might be helpful, but it's likely you're probably going to need some additional things over and above that, not least, we've talked already about the associated persons bit, and making sure that, when you're putting in place your preventative procedures, that those procedures apply to your associated persons, which sounds a really simple thing to say, but a lot of the focus on existing procedures and protocols will be on a company's employees or the people within the four walls of an organisation. CCO is arguably slightly different in many ways, in that it could be someone who's not sat within the four walls of your organisation, but acting on your behalf. Your preventative procedures have to cover those people as well. So that's one area where I think making sure that there's an external focus to preventative procedures is really important.
Yeah, it sounds like almost the starting point really for the corporate criminal offence is understanding, I suppose, where the risks lie, and that's where your associated persons can facilitate tax evasion, and that's going to be different to like the Bribery Act risks, for example, isn't it? But then by the sounds of it, almost the approach in terms of how they then prevent that risk might be similar, so they can use that as a starting point, but in itself, it's probably not going to be enough.
Yeah, exactly. So the level of exposure might be different, associated persons might be different, but you might come to the conclusion that some of the protocols around, for argument's sake, high value transactions, or the number of things that one employee can do before someone else has to authorise something, as a really basic example, some of those things that might be in place for bribery, corruption, money laundering might give you a degree of cover for some aspects of CCO, but it's just making sure that organisations don't rely solely on what they've already put in place to give them cover for CCO.
Yeah, that makes sense. I know, Sam, you've already touched upon this a little bit already, but are there any sectors or industries out there that are kind of deemed much higher risk than others under CCO? So I know you've mentioned kind of financial services, and I think that's an obvious one, but are there any ones that aren't related to the financial services that are high risk as well?
So I try not to get too much into identifying particular sectors, because I think they will invariably, different sectors will pose different types of risk and different degrees of risk. So that could be, where there might not be a high level of awareness in a particular sector about CCO applications. That might present a risk in terms of insufficient sort of procedures in place, as opposed to a sector where there is maybe more opportunity to facilitate tax evasion. So I'm probably more focused on demonstrating the sort of broad application of the offences rather than honing in a couple of sectors. And it's really businesses and organisations that pose the risk, not the sectors, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does. Let's say then, taking on that note, then in terms of the business itself, so are there any departments within businesses where you think there are, say, higher risks of facilitation of tax evasion taking place? So maybe businesses should apply maybe a higher focus in those areas, such as, I don't know, finance or payroll, for example?
Yeah, it's probably a similar answer, Jack. In terms of probably not for something like HMRC to say what is and isn't high risk. We really expect that to come out in a company's risk assessment. That said, there's some common sense and some logic around functions. Some functions within an organisation will have a greater opportunity to facilitate tax evasion, or where there might be additional motivations or incentives around either, attracting new customers or retaining customers or clients. So it's those traditional sort of things that you would look at in terms of fraud prevention and some protocols around that, rather than pinpointing a particular department or function, because again, we see a massive variance in how organisations set themselves up. So we try not to be prescriptive. But as I said before, you'd really expect when an organisation is going through the risk assessment that they'd look at the different functions that their departments do and think, well, what is the opportunity to facilitate tax evasion? What are the existing procedures, protocols? Do we have things that in the past might have been well intentioned in terms of incentivizing employees that could also act as an incentive for people to go above and beyond? So that's probably what I'd say on that.
Yeah, that does make sense. I mean, I suppose that's almost a reference to commission in some ways. So staff who are paid commission, and if they could be incentivized to do something, I suppose, rogue in order to get a higher commission, which is related to the facilitation of tax evasion in some way, then that's obviously going to increase the risk there, isn't it? But by the sounds of it, it's going to depend on the type of job that they've got anyway, where they could get commission from.
Yeah, and I think it's been clear that we're not saying that rewards based, performance based, commission based remuneration is a problem and shouldn't happen. It may well just be that in some organisations that proposes a slightly higher risk of facilitation, and that's not to say that any of the employees will be facilitating tax evasion, but it's just a consideration that an organisation has to think about. So I'm keen when we do talk about things like this, that the same way when sometimes they talk about outsourcing payroll and other things, that's a perfectly good and sound way of running many, many businesses. There just comes an extra degree of risk with that an organisation should be aware of. And I guess the same goes for rewards and incentive-based stuff as well.
Yeah, I mean, maybe the word to describe them then is indicators. Commission could be an indicator of higher risk than not having commission, for example.
Yeah.
And then I suppose just to round off this section then, so I imagine some businesses say they're so low risk that they don't need to do anything because, I don't know, they're really small or something, or they're extremely simple. I mean, have you got anything you would say to businesses who might be thinking that?
Yeah, so I think most, if not all, companies will have a degree of risk and exposure to CCO. And you're right, it may well be that an organisation may not need to put in place a whole load of additional procedures, but that should still really be predicated on the risk assessment. And the risk assessment should probably tell an organisation that it might be a small risk, it might be easily controlled, but there's still a risk there that just needs to be covered up. And, I talked about invoicing before. That can be prevalent in an awful lot of organisations and presents possibly a degree of risk. The company may decide that existing procedures and protocols it's got around, what can and can't be signed off might give them the cover that they need, but it's still worth documenting that as part of the risk assessment and a conscious decision that they're comfortable with the existing procedures and protocols, as opposed to doing nothing and leaving it to chance.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so this kind of section is the part that I'm looking forward to the most, because it's almost like an insider's view into HMRC, obviously within the restrictions of what you can and cannot say to us. But could you just, I suppose, start off by giving us a bit of an idea of the enforcement approach that's being taken by HMRC in relation to CCO?
Sure, no problem. And this is something I've talked about previously. So one of the decisions that are made quite early on was around not creating dedicated standalone CCO investigation teams. And that's really for a couple of reasons. One, it limits capacity to do CCO investigation work on a bigger scale, but also it limits capability as well and confines capability to those dedicated teams. So instead, all of our HMRC or investigation service criminal investigators have been trained and capable of investigating CCO offences. And equally, we talked about the legislation coming in 30th of September 2017. We looked at our existing tax evasion cases. We looked at new cases coming through, and looked at whether or not any had concerns about facilitation and whether any had concerns that they could have facilitated other offences post 30th of September 2017. So there's an opportunity to look at our existing workload and see whether or not CCO has application there. And I think in terms of a general approach, it's almost back to the wider work that I have and the wider responsibility I have about enablers of criminality more generally. So I think what we are doing is a more fundamental shift across, I think, all of our HMRC compliance work to really look at who may be helping customers commit tax evasion. So really trying to identify who the potential enablers might be, looking at how we route those into a central point for further assessment, for further development. So it's as much about really doubling down on how we investigate tax evasion and how we establish how that tax evasion occurs, and if they've, if those taxpayers, those customers have had any assistance in committing that tax evasion. If we do both of those things, we'll increase the number of enablers under investigation, the quality of those investigations. A consequence of that will be more corporate criminal offence investigations.
Mm-hmm.
And specifically, sorry, go on, Jack, are you going to come in there?
I was just going to say then, so by the sounds of it then, all your officers who deal with any type of, I suppose, evasion type of inquiries and that, they've all been trained to do the CCO, to understand CCO and know where it might be something that's worth considering. So then you're almost starting at the evasion of the tax rather than starting at a potential facilitator. So starting at the bottom and then working back up. Is that right?
So we can and do it both ways. So you're right in terms of there being more of a focus on when we're investigating tax evasion, make sure we're understanding who's behind it in facilitation. Our criminal investigators have been trained on investigating CCO cases because it's criminal legislation in a criminal investigation. But all of our civil investigation teams and officers are also aware of CCO legislation, but more importantly, they will also identify cases where there is suspected facilitation of tax evasion, which can quite easily flip over into criminal investigation. So you're right insofar as, doubling down on tax evasion will identify enablers and facilitators, will result in CCO investigation. But equally, we may have an unrelated case, an unrelated issue, which points to a potential enabler, facilitator who becomes the focus of an investigation. So we might even start at stage 2 in some instances. And by investigating that enabler, that facilitator, we identify the customers whose tax evasion they facilitated. If that makes sense?
Yeah, it does. So I think just to make sure I've got my head around it then, it's almost as if you got an officer who's doing like an employment tax review or something, and as part of that review then as well, they could spot that, I don't know, there's some weaknesses or that something underhand might be happening within that business, which could ultimately be facilitating tax evasion. So you can start from the other end as well in those cases. Is that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes sense then. So in terms of kind of active cases then on CC, how has HMRC got many of them? Is there any kind of common trends that you're seeing with them if you have got many?
So we've got, so in terms of our live investigations, I try to publish reasonably regular updates on the gov.uk site. I think we've probably got one due the next 6 weeks or so. But the last update, we were at 13 live criminal investigations, so 13 potential CCO charges. with a further 18 opportunities under review. And those sort of opportunities under review will be areas where we've either got suspicion or evidence of the tax evasion, and we've got suspicion or evidence of facilitation. We're just working through the construct of CCO. So not all of those live investigations will result in charges and prosecutions in the same way that any other criminal investigation doesn't always result in prosecution or charge. And all of those sort of 18 opportunities under review, not all of those will result or become CCO investigations. But a big thing that I'm always keen to emphasise as part of these updates, so those sort of 31 investigations and opportunities cover 10 different business sectors and businesses of all shapes and sizes. So, when we talked before about, sometimes people will jump to a large financial institution, for example, and say, oh, well, that's what CCO is all about. Been really, really clear in all of the discussions that I have, events such as these, that it's far broader than that. And it's really important that our enforcement action underpins that. What I would say though, Jack, is, and again, it's something I'm always keen to reiterate. This legislation wasn't introduced simply just, to try and increase the number of corporate prosecutions. It's very much about how we try and change long-standing industry practices or behaviours that have sometimes, become considered the norm. And as ever, we want to help people and businesses get this right as much as possible. Podcasts like this and other external engagement events have done all about doing that. But equally, we are prepared to and are enforcing the legislation with a compliance response for those who aren't engaging in complying. So whilst the number of investigations we've got, I'm reasonably comfortable with, and the pipeline of work is continuing to develop, it's as important for me to see the behavioural changes that we're seeing across businesses and sectors, seeing the preventative procedures that are being put in place, because that's what we want. We want to limit the opportunity for facilitation to occur. If we're in a position where we are always reliant on an enforcement response, then we've probably got something wrong. So you really have to try and get the balance right between those two things.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you're really trying to prevent the need for even to get to a point where you might need to prosecute someone. That's kind of the overall intention. But then obviously where people slip through the net and end up committing the offence, that's when you'll look at prosecuting.
Spot on.
And so then just, I suppose, for interest really then, so you said you don't necessarily prosecute everyone. So if you don't actually prosecute them, I imagine you can't issue any fines or anything along those lines, only for the ones that you do end up prosecuting. Is that correct?
No, there's potentially, it depends on the cases, the circumstances, the business, the sectors. But HMRC's got a whole load of tools and sanctions that we can apply. There can be regulatory offences. There can be a whole load of other things. If there's I think in certain instances, we can make referrals to regulators, professional bodies, a whole load of other things. So it's certainly not CCO or bust. CCO is probably just the biggest and most powerful tool that we've got.
Yeah, makes sense. So obviously you have got those cases ongoing then. I mean, when do you expect that we will actually see the first prosecution by HMRC then under CCO?
So it's always a killer question. But there's probably a couple of things that I'd bring in terms of just how prosecutions work generally, which your listeners may not be too aware of. So HMRC don't actually prosecute cases. HMRC is the investigating authority, so we will investigate the offences, but we won't prosecute them. So by and large, that will fall to Crown Prosecution Service and the other UK prosecution services. As you expect, we are continuing to work with them on implementation, citing our cases, etc., etc. I would also flag that these offences I mentioned before, they're not retrospective. So the tax evasion has to have occurred post 30th of September 2017, and obviously the facilitation has to have occurred post 30th of September 2017. So there are multiple layers within these investigations, each with their own complexities, which take time to work through properly. And that's before you factor in the events of that sort of the last 12, 15 months or so. So there's not necessarily an imminent court date. By the time we publish the podcast, we won't have missed a prosecution. But the court cases are coming. We're making some real progress on those 13 investigations. And as I said, the pipeline's continuing to grow. So I'm quite comfortable with where our enforcement action is. As with any criminal investigation, though, it's working through the evidence that we obtain, getting to the point at which we're happy with that to send it to the prosecutor for a charge. And once we've got that, we work through prepping for trial. So it is a long process in the vast majority of cases. But we've made progress quite quickly with this legislation. I think 3.5 years might sound like a long time, but brand new criminal legislation, implementing it and investigating it, it's quite a short space of time.
Yeah, well, as you say, there's a lot of. Well, first off, the offences had to happen after the start of, I suppose, October 2017, and then you've got to have investigated it. So 3.5 years, I think, it is actually quite a short timescale, isn't it, when you're considering exactly how much work needs to go behind that. But I didn't actually know either that HMRC didn't do the prosecuting, so that's news for me as well, and interesting to know. It's almost like you're the investigators, and then you pass all the information over to the Crown prosecution and any of the prosecutors to actually then do the prosecution on HMRC's behalf, almost.
Yeah, again, that's exactly how the police work. But interesting, different to how the SFO work. So that's where you do get some intricacies in terms of the SFO investigate and prosecute. We investigate, and the prosecution serves to prosecute. So you can be forgiven for not being hugely up to speed with that, Jack. So it's always a good opportunity to flag it when we talk about CCO.
And in terms of people who want to, I suppose, know when that first case has happened, would you be posting about it on LinkedIn, for example?
I will certainly make sure people know about it. I suspect LinkedIn might not be the first place that it's published, but I'll certainly be sharing it as and when that comes through. Assuming we can, of course, there's a whole load of things that come with confidentiality of investigations and at various different points. But in the same way, I've been as open and as transparent as I can be on CCO to date. I'll continue to be as open and transparent as I can be when these investigations are nearing completion.
Yeah, makes sense. And I suppose almost to round off the episode then, so I imagine the tax profession can make a significant impact, could have a significant impact on making sure that people protect themselves against CCO, and also, I suppose, change their behaviours to make sure that they're not facilitating tax evasion in any way. So is there any ways that you think that the tax profession and other tax professionals can go about doing that?
Yeah, certainly not facilitating tax evasion. So starting off from that point, don't facilitate tax evasion would be a good starting point. But joking aside on that, I think it's about continuing to educate the people and the businesses that you work with and for. So, what tax evasion is, why it's different to tax avoidance, tax planning, and ultimately tax evasion. We're talking about a criminal offence. Whilst HMRC and the Fraud Investigation Service might decide in certain circumstances that we're going to use our civil investigation powers to investigate tax evasion, the underlying offence is still a criminal one. It's still a criminal offence. And sometimes, tax isn't always associated with crime. And tax evasion, we're talking about a criminal offence. Facilitation of tax evasion, we're talking about a criminal offence. And I think just reiterating what's different about this legislation. So we talked about it before, but the fact that now companies can be prosecuted for not preventing associated persons facilitating tax evasion, even if senior management and the organisation knew absolutely nothing about it, is a complete diversion from the type of legislation that we've had before. So it is new, it is different, and I certainly think tax professionals can play their part in educating businesses in terms of what they need to do. And I've certainly recognised that and valued that over the past 12 months with the work that I've been doing on external engagement on CCO. think tax professionals did a great job in relation to raising awareness about CCO, and hopefully I can continue to support people in doing that.
Yeah. So really then it's going to be about, I suppose, tax professionals understanding the offence, which I have no doubt this episode will help people with. And then also, I suppose, spreading the awareness to clients if you're an external advisor like I am, or if you're an in-house professional, just for the organisation that you work for yourself. So then just in case there's people want to go and find out more about the offence, then is there anyone in particular that you would point them towards to, I suppose, fully understand the offence, see some examples, understand the 6 guiding principles that were mentioned earlier in the episode?
Yeah, the government guidance, Jackie, can't go too far wrong from trying to understand the principles of the legislation, how it might apply, what those 6 guiding principles look like in terms of preventative procedures. So I think that absolutely has to be the starting point. And then I think a couple of professional bodies or sectors might have done their own interpretation of guidance and other things as well. But the starting point for me will always be that core document, the government guidance. And as I said, I'm continuing to put stuff on LinkedIn as I can and presenting it in a slightly different way, in a slightly easier way for people to understand. But it's not necessarily brand new content or something particularly groundbreaking. The core content should always be back in that government guidance. Anything else around that is additional sort of clarification, interpretation, examples. But as a reference point, I'd definitely point your listeners to that government guidance if they haven't already seen it.
Yeah, and I think that guidance actually is a good piece of HMRC guidance. So I can almost give it a thumbs up as well and recommend it. And then there's also the actual legislation itself, which is in the Criminal Finance Act 2017, I believe.
That's it. It is.
Yeah.
It is.
So anyone that's almost as sad as me and likes going to the legislation, you can head on over to there as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you like this episode, then you can make sure that you don't miss out on any future ones that will help you to progress, develop and improve your tax career by signing up for email notifications at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/subscribe. These will give you a brief summary of each episode so that you can decide if you want to listen. Episodes are bi-weekly and are released on Mondays. You can find a link to the government's CCO guidance, Sam's LinkedIn profile, where you can find the videos he mentioned in the episode, and other useful resources in the show notes at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP25. That's thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP25. And TTPP25 just stands for the Tax Professionals Podcast Episode 25. But that's it for this episode. I hope you liked the episode and have taken away some useful points that you can use to help progress, develop and improve your tax career. Until next time.